The file had been sitting in a locked cabinet in the basement of a government archive building in Washington, D.C. for 67 years before anyone opened it again. It was labeled with a simple code, nothing dramatic, just a string of letters and numbers in faded black ink on a yellowed tab. The cabinet itself was in a room that required two separate keys to enter, and the room was in a section of the building that did not appear on the public floor plan. The archivist who finally found it was not looking for it. She had been looking for something else entirely, a set of supply manifests from the Pacific Theater, and she had opened the wrong drawer. Her name was Captain Miriam Osai, and she was 31 years old, and she was thorough enough to open the file anyway. What she found inside would take her 3 years, 2 research partners, 1 reluctant general, and a trip to 3 different countries to fully understand. And even then, she would spend the rest of her career wondering if she truly understood it at all. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The file contained 43 pages. Some were typed on thin wartime paper, the kind that had gone brittle at the edges with age. Some were handwritten in the careful, compressed script of military men trained to be precise with words. There were photographs, black and white, small and sharp, showing a village in what appeared to be rural France. There were coordinates. There were names, 6 of them, listed in a column with ranks beside them. And at the bottom of the last page, in handwriting different from all the others, someone had written 4 words and underlined them twice. The words were, "We should have listened." Miriam sat in that basement room for 2 hours, reading the file from beginning to end without stopping. When she was done, she sat quietly for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the ceiling. The way a person sits when they have just received news that reorganizes everything they thought they knew about a particular subject. Then she photographed every page with her phone, replaced the file exactly as she had found it, locked the cabinet, and walked upstairs into the ordinary fluorescent light of the archive's main floor. She called her research partner from the hallway. His name was Major Daniel Reeves, and he was the kind of historian who had spent 15 years building a reputation for being absolutely unmovable by dramatic claims. He had debunked 6 so-called mysteries in his career, and had written 2 books about the way wartime confusion generated myths that outlasted the wars that created them. He answered her call on the second ring. "I found something," she said. "You find things every week, Miriam, not like this." There was a pause on the line. He knew her well enough to hear the difference in her voice. "How bad is it?" "It's not bad," she said carefully. "It's just," she searched for the right word, "unexplained. By any framework I currently have." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll be there in the morning." The file, once they had properly cataloged and authenticated it, turned out to document an event that had taken place in October of 1944 in a small village called Vorel, located in the Burgundy region of France, approximately 90 kilometers southeast of Paris. The village had been liberated from German occupation 2 months earlier as part of the Allied advance following D-Day, and by October it was, on paper, a peaceful place. The Germans had left, the fighting had moved east, and the village was in the process of returning to whatever ordinary life looked like after 4 years of occupation. What had brought American military personnel to Vorel in October of 1944 was a report filed by the French Regional Authority describing a situation that the local gendarmerie could not explain and did not want responsibility for. The report used language that was clinical and careful, the language of officials trying to describe something unusual without committing to sounding unusual themselves. It described a group of 6 American soldiers who had been found in the village, alive and uninjured, but in a state that the report called pronounced disorientation and apparent collective amnesia, covering a period of no less than 11 days. 11 days. 6 soldiers who could not account for 11 days of their lives. Their names were listed in the file. Sergeant First Class Henry Aldous Marsh of Virginia, Corporal Thomas Beckett of Ohio, Private First Class Eugene Rains of Louisiana, Private Walter Young of California, Private Dora Siebert, a WWII attached to Signals Intelligence from Minnesota, and Technical Sergeant Clifford Oates of Massachusetts, who was the highest-ranking member of the group and who, according to every document in the file, refused to speak about what had happened for the rest of his life. Miriam and Daniel spent the first week simply building a timeline from the available documentation. The 6 soldiers had been part of a small intelligence-gathering unit assigned to map and assess communication infrastructure in the liberated territories east of Paris. They had been operating in the region since mid-September, a legitimate assignment with legitimate orders. Their last confirmed radio contact with their commanding officer had been at 7:15 p.m. on the 4th of October, 1944. The contact had been brief. Sergeant Marsh had reported that the unit was sheltering in a farmhouse outside Vorel due to poor weather and would resume their route in the morning. His voice, according to the radio operator who received the transmission, had been normal, calm, nothing unusual. They were found on the 15th of October, 11 days later, sitting in the village square of Vorel in a group, as though they had been placed there. Or as though they had simply arrived there and sat down, and were waiting for something without being entirely sure what. The villagers who found them described them as clean and fed and rested, not the state of people who had been lost or in hiding for 11 days. Their uniforms were in good condition. Their weapons were present and unloaded, their equipment was intact, and all 6 of them, when spoken to, were polite and cooperative but could not say where they had been, not vaguely. Not approximately, they simply had no memory of the period. The last thing any of them remembered was the farmhouse, the rain, the evening of the 4th of October. The military investigation that followed was conducted by a Captain Raymond Hollies of the Army's Counterintelligence Corps, and his notes made up the majority of the 43 pages in the file. Hollies was, based on his writing, a patient and methodical man. He interviewed each soldier separately multiple times. He documented every detail of every interview. He examined the farmhouse. He examined the village. He spoke to every resident of Vorel who would speak to him. He consulted with a military doctor about the soldiers' physical and mental condition. He followed every lead he could identify, and when those leads ran out, he followed the spaces where leads should have been but weren't. And at the end of 3 weeks of investigation, he had no explanation. What he had was a collection of fragments. Small details that didn't add up to anything definitive, but that refused to be dismissed either. The farmhouse where the soldiers had last been confirmed had a section of its stone floor that appeared to have been recently cleaned, scrubbed more thoroughly than anything else in the building. A local farmer named Gerard described seeing lights in the forest south of the village on the nights of the 6th and 7th of October. Lights that moved in ways he could not attribute to lanterns or torches. The military doctor noted that all 6 soldiers were in unusually good physical health for people who had supposedly been in the field for 11 days. Better hydrated and better rested than their situation should have allowed. And one soldier, Private Eugene Rains, had a small object in his jacket pocket that he could not explain. It was a compass, not an American military compass, not a German one either. It was older than both, clearly handmade, with markings that no one in Hollies' investigation could identify. The needle did not point north. It pointed in a consistent direction that varied slightly day by day, as though tracking something rather than orienting to a fixed point. Rains did not know where it had come from. He was certain it had not been in his pocket before the 4th of October. He could not say how it had gotten there. Hollies had the compass examined by 2 separate experts. Neither could identify its origin or the system of its markings. He sent photographs of it to a university in Paris. The professor who responded said the markings resembled no cartographic or navigational system he had encountered in 30 years of study. He asked if he could examine the original. Hollies never sent it. The compass disappeared from the evidence log sometime between October of 1944 and the date the file was sealed. No record of what happened to it. Miriam underlined this section 3 times in her notes. The file was sealed in 1945 and classified under a category that no longer existed in the current archival system, which was part of why it had been overlooked for 67 years. Captain Hollies' final summary was 6 pages long and concluded with the observation that he had been unable to determine the cause of the soldiers' absence or the nature of their experience. He recommended further investigation when resources allowed. Resources apparently never allowed. The 4 underlined words at the bottom of the last page were not in Hollies' handwriting. Miriam compared them to every other piece of handwriting in the file. They matched none of the soldiers' documented signatures. They matched nothing. Someone else had opened this file at some point and written those words and closed it again and locked it away, and no one had touched it since. We should have listened. Daniel, who had arrived skeptical and was now sitting across from Miriam in their shared office surrounded by photocopies and research notes, said on the 9th day of their investigation, "I want to find out if any of the 6 are still alive." It was 1944. The soldiers would now be in their late 80s or 90s at youngest. The odds were not good, but Miriam had already been thinking the same thing, and she had already started the search. Walter Yun had died in 1978, Thomas Becket in 1989, Dora Siebert had died in 2003 at the age of 84, Henry Marsh in 2007. Technical Sergeant Clifford Oates, who had refused to speak about Vorel, had died in 2011, and according to his family had maintained that silence completely until his final days. Eugene Rains was 91 years old and lived in a care facility in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Miriam called the facility on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak with him. The staff member who answered was pleasant but cautious, explaining that Mr. Rains had good days and difficult days, and that strangers calling sometimes upset him. Miriam explained who she was and that she was a military historian working on a research project related to World War II. She said she had found some documents that mentioned his service and wanted to ask him about his memories of that time. There was a pause, then the staff member said, "He asks about the war sometimes. He talks about France." Another pause. "Let me check if he's having a good day." She was put on hold for 4 minutes. When the line reconnected, it was not the staff member's voice. It was an old man's voice, thin but clear, with a Louisiana accent that had softened but not disappeared over 91 years. "You found the file," he said, not a question. Miriam sat very still. "Yes, Mr. Rains, I found the file. I always thought someone would," he said. "Took longer than I expected." He made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," she said, "if you're willing." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear his breathing on the line. "I'm 91 years old," he said finally. "I have been keeping this inside me for 67 years. My wife knew some of it. She passed 12 years ago. My children know none of it." He paused. "I am very tired of keeping it." Miriam flew to Baton Rouge 4 days later with Daniel and a small digital recorder, which Eugene Rains gave them permission to use before they had even asked. He was a small man, thin and sharp-eyed despite his age, sitting upright in a chair by his window with his hands in his lap. The facility had given them a private room for the meeting. There was afternoon light coming through the window, warm and golden, and Eugene sat in it like a man who had learned to appreciate warmth. He talked for 4 hours. He remembered the farmhouse clearly. He remembered the rain, how heavy it was, how it came in sideways through the gaps in the shutters. He remembered Sergeant Marsh telling them they would camp there for the night, and Clifford Oates arguing that they were behind schedule and should push on. He remembered Dora Siebert making coffee on a small stove, and Tommy Becket playing cards with Walter Yun by the light of a lamp. He remembered being happy, in the way soldiers are happy when they have shelter from bad weather and their friends are nearby. He remembered going to sleep. And then he remembered waking up in the village square, not arriving there, not walking there. Waking up there as though sleep had carried him from one place to another without his knowledge or consent. Sitting in the morning light on a low stone wall with his 5 companions around him in various states of the same slow awakening, all of them clean, all of them rested. All of them with the particular feeling, he said, of having been somewhere very far away and come back. The kind of feeling you have after a very long and vivid dream that is already fading even as you try to hold on to it. "We didn't talk about it," he said, "not to each other, not to the investigator, not really. We were afraid." He looked at his hands, not afraid of being disbelieved. "We were afraid of what we had been part of, because none of us could say what it was. And not being able to say what something is makes it very big and very dark inside your head." "What do you remember from those 11 days?" Miriam asked carefully. Eugene was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light moved slowly across the floor between them. "Fragments," he said at last, "not whole memories, pieces. Like broken glass where you can see parts of a reflection but not the whole picture." He pressed his lips together. "I remember a place that was not outside and not inside. I remember it being very quiet. I remember that I was not frightened there, which is the strangest part because I should have been." He paused. "I remember the others being there, all 5 of them. And I remember that we were being observed, studied, the way you study something you don't understand but want to. He looked up at Miriam. Not by people, not by Germans. Not by anyone I had a word for. Daniel leaned forward slightly. The compass, he said. The one in your pocket when you came back. Do you know where it came from? Eugene smiled for the first time. It was a small smile with something complicated inside it. It was given to me, he said. By whom? By whatever was observing us. He met Daniel's eyes. I couldn't tell you more than that. I couldn't describe it, but there was a moment, near what I understand must have been the end of those 11 days, where something came very close to me, and I felt something placed in my pocket. And I understood, the way you understand things in dreams without being told, that it was meant as a kind of, he searched for the word, receipt, a record of a meeting. The room was very quiet. The compass didn't point north, Miriam said. No, Eugene agreed. I noticed that in the brief time I had it, it pointed somewhere, consistently. I never found out where. He paused. I think it pointed back to whatever place we had been. He looked out the window at the afternoon. It was taken from me during the investigation. Hollies' team logged it, but then it disappeared. I was never surprised by that. Why not? Daniel asked. Because there was a second investigator, Eugene said, not Hollies. Someone else who arrived 3 days after Hollies, and who sat in on the interviews and never introduced himself, and never took notes that I could see, and never asked questions. He just watched. And on the day I noticed the compass was missing from the evidence table, he was gone too. He turned from the window. Whoever he was not counterintelligence corps. His uniform was right, but something else was wrong. His questions, the few he asked, were too specific. He already knew things that Hollies was still discovering. Eugene folded his hands in his lap. He knew about the compass before anyone showed it to him. Miriam looked at Daniel. She could see the same thought moving across his face that was moving across hers. Clifford Oates, she said to Eugene. He never spoke about this his whole life. Eugene nodded slowly. Cliff was the most frightened of all of us, not during, I think. I don't believe any of us were frightened during, but after, when we were back and couldn't explain it, and the world wanted explanations, Cliff couldn't manage that gap. Between what had happened and what could be said about it, he paused. He was a good man, very precise, very ordered. He needed the world to make sense. And this, he gestured vaguely, this permanently disturbed his sense of what made sense, so he locked the door on it and never opened it again. Eugene was quiet for a moment. I understood him. I chose differently. I kept the door in my mind slightly open, just a crack. Because it seemed wrong to me to completely refuse the experience, even if I couldn't explain it. What do you think happened to you? Miriam asked. She asked it directly without softening, because she felt that Eugene Raines deserved that directness after 67 years. He looked at her for a long moment. He was 91 years old, and he had been turning this question over in his mind for the majority of his life. I think we encountered something, he said, that was as curious about us as we were confused about it. I think it took us somewhere, or took our understanding somewhere, to look at us more closely. And I think it returned us carefully, which is why we were rested and unharmed. And I think it left me that compass because it wanted to give something back, the way you leave a small gift when you have borrowed something from someone without asking first. He paused. I don't know what it was. I am not going to say the word that everyone wants to say when I describe this, because I don't have the evidence for that word, and I never did. But something happened to us in those 11 days that was real, and it was deliberate, and it was, in its own strange way. Careful with us, they left Baton Rouge the next afternoon with hours of recorded conversation. A small collection of documents that Eugene had kept privately for decades, including 3 photographs he had taken himself after returning to Vorel in 1972. And the name of a man that Eugene said the unknown second investigator had mentioned once, briefly, in a careless moment that had stayed in Eugene's memory for nearly 70 years. The name was Arthur Vance. Back in Washington, Miriam and Daniel spent 2 weeks searching for Arthur Vance in military records, government employment records, academic records, and archival databases of the era. They found 3 men with that name who had served in some military or government capacity during the 1940s. 2 of them had straightforward service records and identifiable histories. The third, an Arthur James Vance, had a personnel file that began in 1942 and ended abruptly in January of 1945, 3 months after the Vorel incident. With a notation that read simply, transferred to special projects, file sealed by executive order, special projects. File sealed by executive order. In January of 1945, Daniel sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. There is a department, he said carefully, or there was a department that handled unusual cases during and after the war, things that didn't fit standard military categories. I have always treated references to it as conspiracy mythology, and now, Miriam asked, he looked at her. Now I'm not sure what I treat it as. They filed a formal research request to access Arthur Vance's sealed file on the grounds of historical scholarship and the passage of time. The request was denied within 24 hours, which was in itself unusual since most requests of this kind took weeks to process. The speed of the denial suggested that someone had been watching for requests related to this file. Miriam noted this in her research log with the same careful neutrality she applied to everything. They appealed the denial. 3 weeks later, a meeting was arranged. It took place in a conference room in a building that Miriam had walked past 100 times without paying particular attention to. In a part of Washington where unremarkable buildings were perhaps the point. The person who met them was a woman in her late 50s named Dr. Carol Anand, who introduced herself as a historical liaison for a government department that she named with an acronym that neither Miriam nor Daniel recognized. She was pleasant and professionally warm and completely impenetrable. She told them that Arthur Vance had been a real person who had worked in a real capacity for the U.S. government during and after World War II. She told them that his work had related to the investigation and assessment of anomalous events reported by military personnel in the European and Pacific theaters. She confirmed without inflection that the Vorel incident had been one of the cases he investigated. What was his conclusion? Daniel asked. Dr. Anand looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile. His conclusion was classified, she said. It's been 67 years, Miriam said. Yes, Dr. Anand agreed pleasantly. Those soldiers are almost all dead. Eugene Raines is 91. We are aware of Mr. Raines, she said, which made Miriam's skin prickle slightly. What can you tell us? Miriam asked. Doctor. Anand considered this for a moment. She folded her hands on the table and looked at them both with the expression of someone deciding how much to pour into a cup without spilling it. I can tell you that Arthur Vance's investigation reached a conclusion that was considered, at the time, too disruptive to the functioning of an active war effort to be shared broadly. That the decision to seal the file was made at a high level and was considered, by those who made it, the most responsible course of action available. Responsible to whom? Daniel asked. To the soldiers who were still fighting, she said simply. To the people who needed those soldiers to remain functional and focused. She paused. There are things that, if widely known during a war, would make it very difficult for people to do what needs to be done, not because people are weak, but because some questions are large enough that they can consume a person if they don't have the space to sit with them carefully. Miriam looked at her. The 4 words at the bottom of the last page, she said. We should have listened. Who wrote that? For the first time, something shifted slightly in Dr. Anand's expression. Something that might have been surprise or something older than surprise. You found that, she said. Yes, Vance wrote that, she said quietly, in his own file at the end of his career. He went back to the Vorel file before he retired and he added those words. She was quiet for a moment. He believed by the end of his career that the encounter in Vorel had contained information. That whatever the soldiers experienced had been attempting to communicate something specific. And that by sealing the investigation and treating the event as a security issue rather than a research opportunity, that communication had been permanently lost. The conference room was very quiet. What was the information? Miriam asked. Dr. Anand shook her head once very slightly. He never determined that. Which was, I believe, exactly his point. They left the meeting with more questions than they had arrived with, which was, Miriam thought, perhaps the most honest outcome that meeting could have produced. They walked for a long time along the National Mall without speaking, in the gray November afternoon with the trees bare and the reflecting pools still and flat. After a while Daniel said, We're not going to get everything. No, Miriam agreed, we're not going to solve it. No, he walked for another block. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, but less than I expected. She looked at the path ahead of them. Eugene Raines kept a door in his mind slightly open for 67 years. Vance spent his career trying to listen to something he'd already been told once and missed. She paused. I think the honest thing to do is document what we know, say clearly what we don't know, and leave the door open. Daniel nodded slowly. That's going to be a very unsatisfying paper, probably, she said. But it will be a true one. They published their research 18 months later in a military history journal that normally dealt in considerably more straightforward material. The paper was titled simply, The Vorel Incident, October 1944, A Historical Assessment. It laid out every documented fact, every interview, every fragment of evidence, in the careful and methodical way that Miriam had approached the whole investigation. It described what was known and was explicit about what was not known. It presented Eugene Raines's account with full context and without editorial judgment. It noted Arthur Vance's 4 underlined words and what Dr. Anand had told them about their origin. The paper did not reach a conclusion, except one. That 6 American soldiers had experienced something in the Burgundy countryside in October of 1944 that no subsequent investigation had been able to fully explain. That those soldiers had been found unharmed, that the most senior among them had spent his life in silence and the youngest had spent his life in careful, quiet witness. That a compass had existed for a short time, pointing somewhere that no one had ever been able to name and had then disappeared. And that somewhere in the chain of decisions made between 1944 and the present day, something had been heard and not listened to. The paper generated more correspondence than anything either of them had ever published. Letters and emails from military historians, from veterans' families, from researchers in 5 countries. One letter came from a woman in Lyon, France, who said she was the granddaughter of Gerard, the farmer who had seen the lights in the forest. She said that her grandfather had talked about those lights his entire life. She said that the village of Vorel still placed flowers on the low stone wall in the village square every October, though most of the current residents could not say exactly why the tradition had started. And one letter came from an address in Massachusetts, from a woman who said she was the daughter of Clifford Oates. She wrote that her father had died in 2011. She wrote that in the final weeks of his life, when he was no longer able to maintain the silence he had kept for 65 years, he had spoken, not in full sentences, not in complete stories. In fragments, the way Eugene Raines had described his own memories. But in those fragments, the daughter wrote, there had been one thing that he said repeatedly, in the moments between sleeping and waking when the barriers we build in ourselves grow thin. He had said it was trying to tell us something about what was coming, what was coming. The end of one war and the slow, grinding approach of another kind of world, colder and more terrified than the one before it. Or something larger and longer, and beyond the comprehension of men sheltering from rain in a farmhouse in the autumn of 1944. Miriam read this letter twice and then sat with it in her hands for a long time in the quiet of her office, in the late afternoon light, thinking about a compass needle pointing at something no one had ever named. And a very old man in Louisiana who had kept a door in his mind, slightly open for 6 decades, because it seemed wrong to him to refuse the experience. And a word written 4 times in underlined ink on the last page of a file that had waited 67 years for someone to open the wrong drawer. She wrote back to the daughter of Clifford Oates and thanked her for writing. She asked if she would be willing to share anything else her father had said in those final weeks. The reply came 3 weeks later. There was, the daughter wrote, one more thing. On the last night of his life, her father had been very still and very calm, the agitation of the preceding weeks finally quiet. He had looked at the ceiling for a long time. And then he had said, softly and clearly, as though answering a question that had been waiting 67 years for the right moment. We should have stayed. Miriam printed this email and placed it in the folder beside the file. She sat in her office with the late light fading around her, and she thought about what it meant to stay. To stay in a place that was beyond your understanding, beyond your training, beyond every framework you had been given for what the world was and was not. To stay and listen instead of returning to the familiar and the silent. She did not know what had happened in those 11 days in the forests of Burgundy. She accepted that she would never know entirely. But she believed, with the particular conviction that comes from sitting with a question long enough that it becomes part of you, that whatever had been there had been reaching toward them. That the encounter had not been hostile or random, but had been deliberate and careful, and had left a young soldier from Louisiana a compass and a memory in 67 years of a door held slightly open. And she thought about Arthur Vance, returning to a sealed file at the end of a long career, picking up a pen, and writing 4 words that amounted to the most honest summary of a life's work that a person could manage. We should have listened. She closed the folder. Outside her window, the city moved in its ordinary ways, full of noise and motion and the business of the present day. But somewhere in the Burgundy countryside, in a village called Vorel, flowers were placed on a stone wall every October by people who couldn't quite say why. And the forest to the south of the village stood thick and quiet in the autumn dark, and whatever had been there in 1944 was either still there or was long gone. And the difference between those two possibilities was the kind of thing that kept a person awake in the small hours of the night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence and wondering, with the particular wonder of someone who has looked at the edge of something vast and unnameable, whether the silence was truly empty or whether it had simply been waiting, this whole long time, for someone to finally pay attention.